Hello, class. Today's lesson from the Little Professor is on fragments and run-ons. A sentence must have both a subject and a verb, and it must express a complete thought. Fragments are defined as only a part of a sentence. A phrase fragment is missing a subject, a verb, or both. In our example, on the highway during rush hour, we are missing a subject and a verb. A revision of this fragment is: the accident occurred on the highway during rush hour. In the revised sentence, we include a subject, accident, and a verb, occurred. A clause fragment consists of a dependent clause, which has a subject and a verb, but does not express a complete thought. Dependent clauses begin with subordinating conjunctions such as, because, before, since, though, unless, until, and when. Relative pronouns such as that, which, who, whoever, whom, whomever, and whose, or relative adverbs such as how, when, where, and why. You can correct clause fragments by joining them to a neighboring independent clause. For example, in the fragment, before we leave for New York, we only have a dependent clause. So we need to connect this dependent clause to an independent clause, either before or after the dependent clause. In our revision, we begin with the independent clause as we connect it to the dependent clause. We need to establish some travel plans before we leave for New York. So we have joined the independent clause to the dependent clause. Notice in the independent clause, at the beginning of the sentence, we have the subject we and the verb need. So we now have a complete sentence. Run-on sentences consist of two sentences written as if they were one. For example, I only rehearsed briefly, I know my lines, is an example of two sentences without appropriate punctuation to separate them. A comma splice is a type of run-on sentence in which two sentences are incorrectly joined by only a comma. So for example, with the same sentence, I only rehearsed briefly, comma, I know my lines. The comma is not sufficient to separate those two independent clauses, those two sentences. You may correct run-on sentences in the following ways. First, you separate the two sentences with a period. And in our example, I know my lines, period, I only rehearsed briefly. You may also correct the run-on sentence by joining the two sentences with a comma plus a coordinating conjunction. Examples of coordinating conjunctions are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. In our same example, we have I know my lines, comma, so I only rehearsed briefly. So unlike the example above with the comma splice, now we have both a comma plus one of the coordinating conjunctions, which is the proper way to separate two complete sentences. Another way to separate the sentences is with a semicolon. So in our same example, I only rehearsed briefly, semicolon, I know my lines. Take note that following a semicolon, ordinarily you would use a lowercase first letter, not a capitalized letter as you would when following a period. The final way to correct the run-on sentence is to separate the two sentences with a semicolon and a conjunctive adverb. Examples of conjunctive adverbs are furthermore, consequently, nevertheless, however, therefore, and finally. In our example sentence, I know my lines, semicolon, consequently, I only rehearsed briefly.